Hey y'all, welcome to A Fistful of Dice. I apologize for the brief hiatus from videos. In trying to improve my setup, get a better camera, better lighting, and all of that, I ended up creating a bunch of technical difficulties for myself, and a bunch of problems arose in my process. So it's also been incredibly hot here in Western Washington, and it's been impossible to set up my lights and be in the same room as my computer, which puts out a lot of heat. This is going to be the continuation of my campaign crafting series. This episode is going to be about creating the people of your world, and I've entitled this episode Cultures and Conflicts because it focuses on the different empires and cultures and kingdoms that you're going to populate your world with and how they're going to interact with each other. So when thinking about the cultures in the world and the campaign that you're building, there's a few different things you should think about. The first thing you should think about is terrain. How did these people get to where they are and why? If they're built at the mouth of a river, what are they importing or exporting? If they have their cities along the coasts, why are they along the coastlines? Do they have their homes in the forest? Do they live in the mountains? Is the climate of where they are, is it frigid? Is it tropical? Is it temperate? It's really important to think about the land that these people occupy because people are shaped by their homeland. And conversely, the homeland can be shaped by its people. The next thing I like to think about is different aspects of the culture. Now, this is a pretty vague, broad term, so let me kind of explain it for you. Aspects of a culture can be things like their imports and exports, their common professions, their fields of study, what they excel in physically, socially, mentally, spiritually, their religion. It's basically a defining trait that sets this culture apart from other similar cultures. The next thing you want to think about, and this is probably the most important when it comes to creating your cultures, is motivations. What does the leadership of this culture want? What are the goals of this empire, of this religion, of this culture, this town, this city-state? What are they striving towards? If your people don't have a goal, it's like a character without a motivation. They're not going to go anywhere, and they're not going to be an entity that is moving the wheels of your world. When you're thinking about a campaign and you're thinking about a world that you're building, you want everything to be constantly in flux. You want things to be moving, and every action, every word that anyone says should be trying to attain a goal, should be moving towards something that they want. And the fourth thing to think about is a real-world inspiration. I always look to real-world cultures, whether they be modern or medieval or ancient or antiquity, just so I can kind of have a jumping-off point and an easy inspiration for flavor and for how the culture works and operates, whether it be socially or government-wise. So I'm just going to give you three examples from my world, and for the most part, the races follow kind of traditional fantasy tropes, but I do like to kind of set them apart and make them their own unique thing in my world, and you should try to do the same for yours. The first culture I'm going to talk about is the High Elves, otherwise known as the Eldar. And I've actually done a video on how I do High Elves in most of my games, and there will be a link down below. But here's how they play out in my campaign world. So the High Elves in my game maintain a large empire known as the Eldar Imperium. And I kind of, when I was creating the High Elves for this world, I looked a lot at ancient Japanese and Chinese societies and how their governments and religions and sort of caste systems worked. So in my current campaign world, there have been 3 Imperiums, which are essentially dynasties. And these dynasties have rose and fell with events that have likewise shaped my world, whether it be wars or environmental disasters, things like that. For example, the first Imperium fell shortly after a climactic battle between the Imperium and dragons, who they were formerly allies with. The elves of the Eldar Imperium live in the plains and valleys of my world. The world is essentially split into 3 regions. There's the your typical frigid tundra in the north, which is where the Mountain Dwarves live. There's a large temperate area in the middle known as Midori, or the Greenlands, which is where most of the elves and halflings and humans live. And then far to the south, there's a region known as the Savage Steppe, which is where a lot of the orcs and ogres and more savage races were exiled to long ago. So the Eldar Imperium actually takes up a large, sizable portion of Midori, the Greenlands, in the central part of the continent. Previous Imperiums have taken up even more land and even stretched from coast to coast, but this one is somewhat isolated on the western coast. So, because they live in the valleys and the plains, it makes sense that the elves would be competent horse lords, because they have lots of open ground to cover that is pretty comfortable for horses. They would probably use horses as their chief mode of transportation. So right there, I've got some flavor I can add to the elves. Now let's think about aspects of the culture. As far as the elves go, I've already kind of mentioned it. It's all about arcane magic and using arcane magic to better the world and bring light to less enlightened people. Other aspects of the culture are that they have a semi-strict caste system where there is a noble class and a lower class, and it's sort of broken up between nobles, and then you have artisans and tradesmen, guildsmen, things like that, and then you have sort of the serf or the peasant class, and then things like half-elves sort of fall even below that. Other aspects of the culture is that the Imperium is very a proud, stubborn nation, in that they are sort of isolationist at times. As far as motivations go for the High Elves, their main goal, or the main goal of the leadership at least, which is comprised of an emperor and his or her regents, which command small armies and are called to the emperor's aid when need be. The main goal of this noble leadership is to reestablish the Imperium. Even though they do own a large portion of the land in Midori, the Eldar Imperium is hell-bent on reestablishing the large territory that they once maintained several millennia ago. So they're kind of wanting to stretch their territory far to the east and farther north as well. Now, I've mentioned on several occasions that in this campaign world there's an object known as the Crucible, which is the source of all magic, or believed to be the source of all magic. The Crucible is in the far north and is currently held by the Mountain Dwarves of the Karlik Union. But the Eldar Imperium is hell-bent on securing the Crucible because they're sort of obsessed with magical artifacts and arcane relics in general. So there has actually been a decades-long war raging between the dwarves of the Karlik Union and the elves of the Eldar Imperium, which has sapped both cultures' resources. But in general, the High Elves are pretty interested in any sort of magical artifacts that they can get their hands on, securing them for their museums and libraries for study. And then as far as real-world inspiration goes for the Eldar Imperium, I've already kind of mentioned this. It's feudal Japan and ancient China, where I'm looking at, the caste system and imperialist attitude. As far as the aesthetics go, they use katanas, they're competent horse masters, the buildings, the structures, the way their cities are laid out, the way they've organized their society is very similar to feudal Japan. So now I've got a fully fleshed out culture for the elves where I can see them fitting into many adventures. If the PCs were going after a magical artifact, who knows, maybe there will be High Elf officials there trying to get the artifact themselves and secure it for the Emperor. All right, now let's talk about Mountain Dwarves. Now, Mountain Dwarves have a government known as the Karlik Union. And the Karlik Union is, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively new government. Several hundred years prior to the current campaign time, the dwarves, the lower class dwarves, rose up against the nobility and established what is known today as the Karlik Union, which was a government built for the people, by the people. But like certain socialist governments in the past, the Karlik Union soon became worse than the regency that it sought to usurp, and those in power soon became corrupt and began taking advantage of the government for themselves. So as far as terrain goes, the Karlik Union is pretty much in control of the northern tundra, which is a land known as Verglass. And Verglass is a wide expanse of open tundra dotted with mountains and bordered on all sides by craggy peaks. It's also a rich land, rich with minerals of all kinds, including mithril and adamantium, which takes us to our next point, the aspects of the culture. The Mountain Dwarves in my campaign are the only purveyors of mithril and adamantium goods. Why is this? Well, because they control the kiln, which, if you've watched my previous episodes, you know is a prison installation located inside of a volcano, which is managed by the dwarves and is the sole manufacturer of mithril and adamantium goods. Because the way I see it, in order to break down these metals that are magically strong, you have to use something as hot as magma, which is why the dwarves use magma forges in all of their smelting. Some other aspects of the culture that I've thought of is that they have recently instituted a draft in a desperate attempt to try to win the war for the Crucible against the Eldar Imperium, which has not gone over so well with certain members of the populace. And in fact, a prominent political figure was executed and in turn became a martyr, which led to a fairly destructive rebellion within the ranks of the Mountain Dwarves. So that kind of gives them a little bit of flavor where they're not only battling against the elves of the Eldar Imperium to try and control the Crucible, but they've also resolved to infighting. As far as motivations go, the Karluk Union wants to maintain its hold on its territory, obviously, and also control its populace. They're not an entirely evil government, as it kind of sounds like, but they are a little bit more sinister and aloof than some of the other cultures in my campaign world. The way the dwarves of the Karluk Union see it, the Crucible is a gift given to them by the gods, and it's up to them to keep it out of the hands of people who would misuse it. Mountain Dwarves don't really like arcane magic, so they recognize that the Crucible is an arcane magical item, and they will stop at any cost to keep it out of the hands of those dirty elves in the Imperium down south. As far as real-world inspiration goes, obviously Soviet Russia is what I took a lot of the inspiration from, and this all started when I got frustrated with the fact that I couldn't do a stereotypical Scottish accent, so a couple of years ago I started giving my dwarves very thick Russian accents, and it's just sort of snowballed from there. The last culture I want to talk about is humans. And I've gotten into so many arguments with people about why humans need to be explained in fantasy games. Obviously, I am a human. We're all humans. We know what it's like to be a human being, but we don't know what it's like to be a human being in a fantastic world surrounded by elves and dwarves and magic and dragons and things of that nature. And we don't understand our place in the world necessarily. So because of that, I actually put forth more effort to give humans a specific niche in the world, rather than saying, well, they're the most common, varied, and adaptable species, which is sort of a cop-out. I try to give them their own special place within the world so that people playing humans get a sense for what they're trying to do. So one of the first things I decided with this campaign world was that humanity was not going to be the most common race, and in fact would be vastly outnumbered by elves and dwarves. All of the humans living on the continent of the Verge are the descendants of escaped slaves. Essentially, a couple hundred years prior to the current campaign time, a huge number of humans led an uprising against their slave masters across the sea and escaped by boat to settle on the coasts of Midori. They built their homes in the ruined temples of a long-lost aquatic civilization that had set up an empire during the Second Eldar Imperium. There they found statues of old gods and began worshipping them, believing that these gods had led them to freedom and salvation. So, terrain-wise, the humans in my campaign world occupy the coasts and riverbanks of the world, establishing cities within the ruins and old temples of a long-lost civilization. As far as aspects go, humans are masters of the sea. The sea was their salvation. It was their way to freedom, and so they revere it more than any other culture. They've constructed incredible marvels, crafts of the sea that can go faster and last longer on the tides. Because of this, humans are very proficient smugglers and couriers for all sorts of goods, and have sort of become the de facto, I don't want to say postmasters, but essentially, if you need something to get somewhere else, you talk to the humans. As far as motivations go, it's only been a couple of generations since humans were in chains. So their main motivation is to make a name for themselves and make a home for their children. They have a lot to prove, I suppose is the case. They're newcomers to this continent, and they're coming into contact with these vast empires controlled by the High Elves and the Mountain Dwarves. And so they're really trying to establish themselves within these sort of political alliances and even the wars going on. As far as real-world inspiration goes, I looked at slavery in America and sort of post-slavery America and sort of took inspiration from that. So there's just a few examples of the cultures that I've populated my world with. I hope you'll take this video and you'll do the same with your cultures, focusing on the motivations and goals of your culture's leadership. And like I said earlier, you always want everything to be moving. You want everything to be acting. It's not like when your adventuring party turns their gaze away from the elves that they're just going to sit tight while the party goes off on adventures. No, everything is always in flux in a game world, and it's not just happening all right in front of your party. Try to remember that. As always, don't get overwhelmed and have fun with it. It's all just a game anyway. So that's going to be it from me, guys. I hope you've gotten some use out of this episode of Campaign Crafting. Look forward to more in the future. Take care, and happy gaming all.